I am going to speak to you on the topic about the Supreme Council of Kenya Muslims, and I'm asking what is supreme about the Supreme Council of Kenya Muslims. We had invited the officials from Supreme Council, but they are not here. They haven't arrived yet, and we thought it would be good for them to listen so that they can live with one or two, and they can also provide us with some kind of critique of our work, because sometimes I think when we go to do our research with these groups, they're always very suspicious of what is it that we want to do, what is it that we say about them. So we invited them to come, and maybe they're on their way. So I will begin. Over the last 2 decades, the question of representativeness, broadly referring here to the legitimacy criteria of representative groups, has become a key reform project of global and local governance. Groups like Supreme Council of Kenya Muslims have, for a very long time, claimed that they are representing the interests of Muslims. So for almost 4 decades, the Supreme Council of Kenya Muslims has been the most dominant Muslim representative group in Kenya. Despite its many challenges, SUPKEM remains the only widely recognizable and legitimate group amongst other groups who often emerge to claim the role and authority to speak on behalf of Muslims. How SUPKEM has managed to maintain this posture for so long has to do with its clever positioning of its claims to representativeness and the ambiguity of its meaning. While it often appears as a cure for the legitimacy deficit of local Muslim religious organizations, the usefulness of this notion in understanding Muslim politics in Kenya has hardly been assessed. Now, this discussion provides a socio-historical account of representativeness based on the political and social history of the Supreme Council of Kenya Muslims. Of course, the oldest umbrella organization formed to represent Muslim interests in Kenya. I discuss SUPKEM's evolving righteous representation. I look at its major personalities, its various antecedents, opponents, and antagonists. So this discussion makes 3 principal observations. First is that the Council was, and still remains, a critical public forum for the articulation of Muslim identity within a democratizing nation state. Second is that the Council emerged from a confluence of local dynamics and developments in the wider Muslim societies that shaped its distinctive organizational identity. And 3, that it's a key precursor to Muslim struggles against marginalization and peripheralization of its community. Now, these arguments rest upon a survey of an impressive range of previously unassessed and underutilized archive published by the Council. That means that for me to be able to discuss the Supreme Council, I was actually allowed access to a lot of their organizational files where they kept records of their meetings and discussions of the issues that they were dealing with. And I also had to look at, to interview some of their officials, and also to review some reports in the newspapers. So these sources provided useful and critical insights on how the Council implemented a desire to accommodate, through a cooperativist strategy, a diverse range of actors spanning the divides of region and ethnicity, activists, and scholars. That means that as SUPKEM was stating a claim to be representing Muslims, it also had to take care of the interests of very diverse a group of actors that included people who are within the Council, who are representing regional identities, who are representing diverse ethnic groups. Some of them within the Council itself, they were activists, and also they were scholars. So as I was going through the minutes and the way that they were deliberating, I could see that all these interests groups of interest, they articulated representativeness differently. And almost each one of them appeared to express a certain desire to represent a very, very specific concern, a very, very specific interest, as they all together performed that desire to represent Muslims. So the Council's desire to remain the most authoritative, the most legitimate, and probably the only such representative body, and therefore the supreme, resulted into constant shifting of its politics as manifest in the organizational challenges. It raised interpersonal conflicts and disputes over strategy. Now, as SUPKEM was stating this claim to be representing the Muslims, within the council itself, there were very serious disputations over strategy. There were serious disputations over what does it mean to represent the Muslim interest. There were serious disagreements sometimes over how do you go about articulating Muslim interests. Equally fascinating is the impact of extra-regional and or international developments on the course of local events. So these linkages are manifest in the influence of political discourse from the wider Muslim world. Reviewing the genesis of the organization, so this discussion points to the evidence that the strategies and mechanisms used by SUPKEM to effect representativeness are embedded in a broader local socio-historical, political, and economic context. Moreover, they have been subjected to contestations and transformations, which resulted in SUPKEM claims to representativeness to become both a political resource and an analytical category for the study of a religious community and its efforts to survive through transformation. So for the SUPKEM, the essence of representativeness is to justify who can legitimately be present within the organization and influence its course of action. The legitimation process is contingent to the global context in terms of both institutional space, that is the national, then transnational and global, and the subject matters, that is the legitimation of representation of SUPKEM is dependent on their position in the national scene. It depended on their position in the transnational and the global scene. But also it was dependent on what kind of subjects, what kind of issues were they dealing with. And in this case, I have examples on how the SUPKEM was dealing with issues of personal laws, facilitation of the Hajj, the constitutional review processes, and how they were addressing themselves or representing Muslims in electoral bodies. So to precisely deconstruct the meanings, practices, and actions of representativeness within the framework of the SUPKEM is to stress that the organization's legitimate representativeness occurs through the means of selecting actors. That within SUPKEM, representativeness occurred through the means of selecting actors. And actors were selected purposely in the form of district councils. And if you ask SUPKEM to explain how they are representative, they'll very first tell you that they are the only organization that has representation throughout Kenya, throughout now the 49 counties of Kenya, and that they have representatives at the district level. Now I think they have changed, it's at the county level. Okay, so they claim that they have people who are members of SUPKEM at the county level. And then the second level is through selecting actors to join the executive committees. So within the SUPKEM, they have an executive committee that is selected, and people join in this executive committee and make decisions on behalf of Muslims. So the legitimate character of representation is therefore twofold, since it has to be acknowledged by both the organization as a whole, which is a top-down, and by the people that the representatives claim to speak on behalf and act on their behalf. So this is now bottom up, that first of all, the organization has to recognize that you can represent, and then the people, that is Muslim citizens, must be able to say that, agree that you can actually speak on their behalf. The efforts to fulfill these two requirements turns the council's representativeness claims to both a functional resource for powerful actors, but also as a source of contestations benefiting political and economic margins. That means that, as SUPKEM says, we are representative of all Muslims. It has also created within it contestations, because there will be people who say, well, we have been left out, and we do not participate in this act of representation. And most of the time, these are professional organizations that are normally not included in SUPKEM. You have, for example, the ulama class. They are not included in representation of the SUPKEM. And in SUPKEM's history, these have been interlocutors who have constantly contested how SUPKEM is representing the Muslims. For example, the ulama class, if you look at SUPKEM's internal organization, you find that it is a body that represents Muslims, but it's formed by people who we cannot say that they belong to the ulama class. Even though the SUPKEM itself recognizes the importance and significance and this important role that the ulama play in Muslim representation. Yet, the SUPKEM itself, it doesn't have the ulama as members of the council. Women, a very important segment of society. Yet you hardly find that they will be represented in its executive councils, as well as other professional groups. You find that SUPKEM recognizes that lawyers are very important, and other professionals, but they do not have representations. So how does SUPKEM include these categories of actors, categories of Muslims, and make them part of their group? They have a very unique idea of creating ad hoc committees, creating ad hoc membership. So in the event that the Supreme Council desires to enjoy the services of legal practitioners, professional lawyers, okay, they might not be members of the council, but they can easily form an ad hoc committees of Muslim lawyers. Okay, they can form an ad hoc committee of Muslim professionals and provide them with a task to fulfill on their behalf. Now, when I analyze this as a strategy to representativeness, I find it to be creating a very precarious position of how do you represent Muslim societies. Because ultimately, whatever decisions that these professional bodies would make, whatever advice that they would provide, still it has to go through the Executive Council or the Supreme Council, and they have to make the decision on whether they will implement it or not. Okay. So, while these professional bodies would have worked very hard to provide their skills and their knowledge, but then the implementation of the decisions will ultimately depend on people who are not particularly professional in those areas. So the socio-historical analysis of SUPKEM suggests changing configurations, interactions, and interdependence between different Muslim actors. And within these Muslim actors, you find that there are state bureaucrats, there are elites, civil society actors, activists, and the ulama. It allows a review of the actors who have used representativeness as a political resource to achieve certain goals within the organization and the wider society. So in its quest for supreme representativeness, the Council created a set of legal requirements consisting of regulations of relations through its constitution, primarily thought of as a means to achieve broader functional goals, but also efforts at checking any infringements of its claim to supremacy by other emerging claimants. The impetus for representativeness as functional representation is expressed both at the SUPKEM district level through the selection of most representative persons and at the organization level through the composition of the executive committee. As institutions rely upon an ambivalent dynamic of inclusion and exclusion, the claims of representativeness of SUPKEM was deeply rooted in its dynamic, in this dynamic, particularly from the 1990s onwards, when marginalized Muslim actors demanded for better representation. Now, in the 1990s, because the SUPKEM itself was formed in the mid 1970s, and it became the main representative body until in the 1990s, when Muslims began to raise questions on how is Supreme Council representing us. And it is because in the 1990s, society itself was experiencing a lot of changes. The 1990s was a period where Kenya moved from a one-party state to a multi-party state. And society began to open up for diversities of ideas, diversities of thinking. It was a time when the Kenyan society in general was experiencing significant transformations. And there was a desire by Muslims to ensure that also their leadership institutions experienced and articulated these transformations. But there was a lot of disquiet in the Supreme Council of Kenyan Muslims, while the broader society was debating these changes. And out of this disquiet, questions began to be raised on whether the SUPKEM was entirely being representative of the Muslim interests. And out of this, then, people who felt that now they were being marginalized began to organize themselves. And in my view, the 1990s was an era of where the margins began to reassert their authority and began to claim that it cannot always be that the Supreme Council is the only representative body. So this term margins, it refers to a category of actors, experts, advisors, civil society groups who are neither completely excluded or really included in the Supreme Council. And they form themselves. And examples of this are, for example, the emergence of the Islamic Party of Kenya, the emergence of groups like the Muslim Consultative Council, groups like the Council of Islamic Preachers of Kenya, and groups like NAMLEF. These are groups that emerged in the 1990s to stake a claim that they were also representing Muslims. And now in my paper, I show how a group like the Islamic Party of Kenya challenged the authority of the Supreme Council of Kenya Muslims. And it particularly challenged it by raising questions on the kind of strategies that were used by the Supreme Council to represent Muslims. And very quickly, I'll just narrate to you one of the strategies. Now, when the Supreme Council was formed, it stated very clearly in its memorandum of organization that it will, at every moment, be on the side of government. And I just want to read to you a preamble of the Supreme Council's own purpose for formation. It says, whereas the need for an organization at the national level to represent, coordinate, correlate programs, and assist in the activities and aspirations of the Muslim community and of the numerous Muslim organizations in Kenya has long been acutely felt. And whereas, and I think this is very instructional, whereas the government of the Republic of Kenya has always urged and encouraged the formation of Muslim national body accepted by representing and acting for all Muslims of Kenya and their organizations, it is resolved that the Supreme Council be formed. Now, there has always been questions asked, and it has always appeared like it is not clear on how was the Supreme Council formed, for what purposes was it formed, how is it going to represent. Now, in this statement, it appears to me that very clearly that the Supreme Council was formed to articulate the desires of government in the way it was dealing with the Muslim community. And I only have 5 minutes, so I will belabor very briefly on this point, because the Supreme Council has been expected to defend the rights of Muslims. For example, on articulating on the issue of Islamic laws, the earliest issue that the Supreme Council had to deal with was when the government desired to create uniform laws, particularly family laws. And the Supreme Council was expected to represent the interests of Muslims. Now, in this particular case, there was a lot of dilly-dallying. And Muslims began to ask, what is the opinion of the Supreme Council? How are they going to lead Muslims to challenge the government intentions to create uniform family laws? Now, I was going through the discussions in the council itself, and I came to the realization that the fact that the council was formed mostly to represent the interests of government made it very difficult for them to come up strongly to raise issues that were going contrary to the desires of the state. That is one. And then second is that within the members of the Executive Council of the Supreme Council, almost all of them were Muslim elites who worked in different government organizations. Some of them were actually members of the cabinet, and therefore making it very difficult for them to raise issues contrary to government policies. And so this, for a very long time, became the kind of leadership strategy that was applicable in the Supreme Council of Kenya Muslims. But the interesting bit is that for the Muslim communities themselves, the expectations were that these are people who should come out very strongly to express what the Muslims themselves are demanding for. Okay, I have 2 minutes. What the Muslims themselves are demanding for. Now, throughout these deliberations, for example, on how do you approach the state, how do you approach the Attorney General, and express the dissatisfaction of Muslims in the Attorney General's desire to create uniform laws, uniform family laws. The members of the council had to engage in an internal debate. And within these internal debates, then I see the different strategies that were emerging, the different personalities that were debating these issues, and eventually why I come to explain why there is significant failure by the Supreme Council to articulate issues on behalf of the Muslims. And just one example, in one of these debates, a strategy was designed to say that, well, the Muslims don't have to really state it in the open that they oppose to these personal laws, but they can find a way to go and speak with the president and advise the president, explain to the president why the Muslims are not happy with with the introduction of these Muslim personal laws. So there was this strategy to say that, well, we can find ways to approach the state in a certain way. Okay, just 1 minute. That we can approach the state in a certain way. And in this certain way, it was creating, for the Muslims themselves, it was creating an impression that they are not entirely citizens, who can articulate issues. But the articulation of issues is dependent on whether they are, for example, Nyayo followers, because you find that in their memorandum to the president, there's a lot of, we are Nyayo followers, we are your loyal Muslims, we are the people who love you, and there are many examples that I could pick to explain that this kind of strategy was not going to work for the Muslims. It was only going to work for the Supreme Council, but not for the Muslims, because the Muslims expected that they would want an organization that would put its foot down and say, we are citizens, we have a right, we are claiming our right as citizens. I don't have enough time, and I hope there are also other researchers here who work on the Muslim organization, and I'll be ready to respond to questions. I'll be ready to accept any additional information that I might have, and also to make some clarifications. Thank you very much.